All right, now let's get started. So welcome to the webinar of teaching supply chain analytics from problem solving to problem discovery. I know the title may sound a little strange, right? Because people usually define and discover problems first and then solve them. However, it is not strange, right, to us, the OR, management science, and decision science people, because we are trained problem solvers, and sometimes we are so good at solving well-defined problems, and we forget about problem discovery altogether. Right? However, problem discovery can be very meaningful and impactful than problem solving, right, to business audience, because nothing in real life is well-defined. Right, and this is what I want to talk about today in this webinar series. I'm sure everybody knows the 4 types of analytics, right? But not everybody noticed that the descriptive and diagnostic analytics, the bottom 2, are really data-driven problem discovery techniques, right? While the predictive and prescriptive analytics, that is the top 2, are really model-driven, right? Are really model-driven problem-solving skills. Right, clearly descriptive and diagnostic analytics, right, have a larger user base and thus more demand for education. Right. However, most current supply chain management and supply chain analytics curriculums focus on model-driven problem-solving skills, and data-driven problem discovery skills are rarely taught systematically, right, at all levels, and practitioners and business audience are thirsty for such skills. And the reason, as Steve Jobs once said, right, if you define the problem correctly, you almost have the solution. Frankly, I think it's a little bit exaggerated, but the point is clear, right? Knowing the right direction to go sometimes is much more important than knowing how to get there fast, right? In another word, so a suboptimal solution to the right problem is better than the optimal solution to the wrong problem. So I think data-driven problem discovery presents a huge uncharted market for higher education and executive programs. All right, so in these webinars, I'd like to share some experiences and modules to teach data-driven, descriptive, and diagnostic analytics to define and discover problems in supply chains, including inventory analytics. That is today, right? To answer questions such as, for which industries is inventory relevant and important, right? On the right, you can see industry classification tree, right? And we can see, for example, information technology, financials, consumer discretionary, telecommunications, and so on, different industries. They have a different amount of industry, right? They have different amount of inventories, right? The question is for which, right, inventory is relevant and important. And second, right, how may inventory affect company's financial performance, right? If I work on inventories, if I improve inventories, what kind of return or payoff can I get from it? And finally, how do I know if I have an inventory problem, right? My company may be running, operating at the optimal already, right? So there's little room for improvements, right? But my competitors may have tons of rooms for improvements. The question is, how do I know, right? Okay, now tomorrow we'll talk about sourcing analytics. Now, sourcing is heavily data-driven, right? Just think about the dollar value of your spend and also number of purchase orders, right, you might have. You will see why data analytics is so critical or important to sourcing, right? We'll talk about tomorrow, right, marketing intelligence to identify and select new suppliers. We'll talk about supplier analysis to assess individual suppliers' technical capabilities, pricing, financial robustness, and efficiency. Now, these insights or intelligence you developed can support sourcing decisions and negotiation, right? Or use Apple's global sourcing of CPUs for iPhone as an example. Okay, in the day after tomorrow, that is the last day of this webinar series, we'll talk about competitive intelligence and benchmarking, right? Using data analytics, right? We will answer questions such as, what are the most valuable segments of my supply chain? That is the segment or in the industries on your supply chain that has the most profits or highest growth. And second, right, what are my strengths and weaknesses, right, relative to my competitors? And finally, what factors may drive a company's financial performance in my industry? Right, so the objective is to discover problems and diagnose causes for a company. Right, we'll use American Airlines, which is one of the largest airlines in the world, and US airlines industry as an example. All right, our focus, right, throughout these webinars will be on data interpretation, right? That is transforming data into insights. Right, data interpretation is not as easy as we might think, right? It can be sophisticated and revealing, right? Saying the same number, right? People may have different interpretations, right? For example, this one, right? What do you see, right? Depends on where you stand, right? And what about this one, right? Some people may see a whole bunch of rocks, while others may see a human face gazing at you, right? The question is, do we really understand the data? So let me give an example to illustrate the sophistication of data interpretation before we get into inventory analytics. So my example is Compaq versus Dell, right? Around year 2001, Compaq was the market leader with the largest market share, right? It also has a higher gross margin and a healthy cash flow and owns many patents. But all of a sudden, right, Compaq sold itself, right, to HP and completely abandoned its strong brand. The question is why? Right, to see this reason, we need to understand some background of the computer industry. Right, computer companies have the same technology such as CPUs and operating systems, and they are really competing on customer service and cost structure. Okay, and here's the data. Right, now, if we truly understand the data, we should know why Compaq sold itself. Right, so you don't need much data. So let's look at their gross margin, their inventories, and their operating costs, and so on. Right, Compaq has a gross margin about 23%, higher than Dell, which is about 21%. However, Dell can operate, right, inventories and others more efficiently, right, with a 5-day of inventory, while Compaq has about 19 days, right, which translates into a lower operating cost over sales for Dell, which is about 10%, and Compaq is about 14%. So in the end, Dell outperformed Compaq by about 1%, right, in operating margin. Right, so here's the question, right? Why is this 1% so critical? That Compaq, the market leader, gave up the competition and sold itself. Do you know why? Just by looking at the numbers. This question actually bothers me for 5 years. I was keep on teaching this case or this fact to students, right? For 5 years, I could not understand what was going on. But 5 years later, I suddenly understand the data. And then I see what a wise decision Compaq was making. Anyone? Okay, just in the interest of time, so here's my understanding. Oh, go ahead.
Inventory for sales were really high.
The interest is really high?
Inventory per sales.
Oh, inventory, yes, that's right. But But would you sell your company just because your interest versus sales is too high? Right, it's one of the important reasons, but we have to look at the picture. We have to look at the data more comprehensively, in the sense that let's first understand why Compact's margin, gross margin, is higher than Dell. Right, recall that they have the same suppliers. So a higher gross margin can only come from two factors. Either you have higher pricing or you get a better deal from the suppliers, right? So because they have the same suppliers and their size is not different by too much. And so the difference in gross margin, a large portion of that comes from different pricing, right? Actually, Dell's selling price of computers actually is on average about 10% less than Compaq. And that's the reason behind this difference in gross margins, right? So, and if you look at their net operating margin, right, their 10% difference, right, in the background of a higher pricing of Compaq, then it starts to make more sense, right? So Dell can make more money even with a lower price, right? Dell can make more money even with a lower price. How can Compaq compete? Now, Compaq can reduce the price and Dell can do the same thing, right? And even more because it has a better cost structure, right? So in the end, and with a lower pricing, right, the market is consistently shifting towards Dell, right? Although Compaq is still market leader, but it sees what's coming. Right? It's really hard to compete. And that's why Compaq sold itself. Right. So not everyone truly understand the data, right? Including those folks in HP. But Compaq saw what's coming and sold itself for $25 billion. Right? What a wise decision. Okay, now a most recent example, right? A similar event happened recently, and many people could not see it, right? You probably heard about that Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, was invited by the US government to open a 5-nanometer factory in Arizona, right, year 2020, right? The news immediately raised a question: why invite TSMC, right? By this picture, right, this is the largest semiconductor manufacturers in the world by revenue, right? By this picture, doesn't the US have the best semiconductor manufacturers in the world, right? Such as Intel, right, Qualcomm, right, Texas Instruments, and so on, right? So if you just look at the revenues, the answer is yes. But if you look at more carefully, the answer might depend. Okay, so let's take a deeper dive into the data. Right, so the data so what I'm seeing here is the data of Intel and TSMC resembles that of Compaq and Dell. Right, just look at the data. It's another Compaq versus Dell case. So here's a value driver analysis between operating margin and the gross margin. Right, the y-axis is the operating margin, x-axis is the gross margin. Right, for semiconductor manufacturers in the US and Taiwan, right, from 2017 to 2019, right before that decision was made. Right, usually these margins will go together. That is, if you have higher gross margins, you'll have higher operating margin. Right, but if you can find a counterexample, then you may discover another Compaq versus Dell case. Right, indeed, INTC, which is Intel, right, has a higher gross margin, about 60% than TSMC, which is about 50%. But despite this higher gross margin, which also means higher pricing, because think about semiconductors, right? They have the same suppliers, right? Like semiconductor equipment and materials. Right? Despite higher pricing, right? INTC, which is Intel, is making less operating margin, which is about 30%, than TSMC, which is about 35 to 40%. Right, in these 3 consecutive years. Now, I'm not saying I'm not saying Intel is another Compaq, right? But what I'm saying is TSMC is operationally much more efficient than Intel, which is a substantial advantage. Okay, now seeing this is very, very important. So it will help us to make strategic level decisions. Right, okay, now let's, now I hope you see the importance and sophistication of data interpretation. Now let us move on, right, to inventory analytics to discuss how to discover inventory problems. All right, I have been teaching inventories for 20 years. I started out just like everybody else, right? Teaching inventory problem-solving skills, such as UQ models, Newspoint models, and RQ models. Now, I have to say I received many complaints, right? In addition to my spoken English, right? Some said that they do not have inventory, and so it is irrelevant. So inventory is irrelevant to their company. Right? The question is, why do I ever teach inventory management? And some others said that they are not sure if inventory will affect the company's bottom line. Now, the problem I figured out later is that they're not motivated, right? They're not motivated. And so my lectures did not make sense. And it's actually my fault because I cannot tell them how to solve a problem without telling them how to discover it in the first place. Right, so thanks to data analysis, I changed, right, my teaching style, right? So I still teach these models, but only after I tell them how to discover inventory problems, right? By answering these 3 questions. So let's answer them one by one today. Right, the first question is, for which industries or countries, right, or which segment of the supply chain, right, is inventory important? So we can better target inventory problems. All right, for many instructors, the importance of inventory, right, boils down to this slide. That's the slide I used about 10 years ago, right? For example, we might tell our students, right, a $4 billion sports retailer may hold $1 billion of inventory. Right, 45 billion pharmacy chain may invest 8.5 billion in inventories. I could even go, you know, a little more statistics, right, to tell them that S&P 500 companies, retailing companies, typically have 25 to 40% of their total assets in inventory. Great. But this is just about US, right? What about other countries? And inventory cannot be important just to retailing, right? What about other industries? And any changes over time? Right? And what about other segments in the supply chain, like upstream manufacturing and distribution industries? Right? Do you want to know? Right? Not the students want to know. So let's take a look. So let's first look at which country holds the most inventory. Right, this is the data. This is the data of publicly traded companies in 2021 reporting year. Right, that is July 2021 to July 2022. Clearly, we can see China is the #1 in terms of the amount of inventories in dollar value, which is followed by the US, Japan, and so on and so forth. Now on the map, we could not see that so clearly. So let's look at the bar chart. Right, so the inventory in dollar value of China is more than twice of that of the US. And that is followed by Japan, Germany, Korea, France, United Kingdom, and India. Okay, let's figure out, right, which industries host the most inventory. And let's look at US, because US is the second largest countries of inventory. So if we first use the measures of inventory as a percentage of total assets, right, to measure the importance of inventories for these industries. But for United States, reporting year 2021, right, we find that banks, right, software and real estate, right, have minimum inventory. So inventory is probably not important for them. Now, we may expect a lot of inventories from the pharmaceutical industries, right? But from inventory as a percentage of total assets, from this perspective, inventory does not seem to be a big issue. However, inventory is a big issue, right? For consumer durables and apparel, 23%. The median is 23% of the total assets is in inventory, right? Retailing, right? Automobiles and components, right? Food stable retailing and technology hardware equipment, right? So for these industries, inventories make a lot of sense. So in particular, if we look at the worst case, right? Consumer durables and apparel have about 67% of their total assets inventory. That's a huge amount of inventory. That's the biggest, it's probably the biggest issue. Inventory is the biggest issue for these companies. Okay, now let's look at a different country, which is China, right? We call that China has the most inventories and highest inventory in dollar value, right, among all the countries, right? So China has many similarities, but also some important difference from the US. Right? Similarities includes minimum inventories for banks and software, right? And high inventory levels for consumer durables and apparel, retailing, right? Food staple retailing, technology hardware, and automobile, and so on. Our important difference, if you look carefully, is real estate, right? Real estate in China actually has the highest inventory in dollar value than all the other industries, right? With a 35% of assets inventory as the median, and the worst case is about 69% of their assets in inventory. All right, now to understand the importance of inventory by industry, let's look at, let's use a different measure, which is inventory days. Right, for the US, right, consumer durables and apparel has a median inventory days about 132 days, right? At worst case, about 341 days in year 2001. That's the past year, right? For food stable retailing, and the best case is about 2 weeks of inventory. Right? This is food and stable retailing, right? And the worst case, about half a year, which is incredible. Right? Pharmaceutical actually has the highest inventory days, although it only accounts for a small percentage of their total assets. But if you look at inventory days, it has a lot, right? And the worst case, about 800 days. Now, for China, consumer durables and apparel, right, is doing better. If you look at numbers, it's doing better in inventory days than US. But its food and stable retailing is actually doing a worse job than US, right? Look at the best case is 1 month of inventories. And the worst case is about 200 days. Now, who's going to buy food from them, right? Think about that. Right. And what is shocking, right, is the real estate, right? The media is 1,200 days. And the worst case is more than 5,000 days of inventory. They're building up apartment or land, right, to sell for the next 10 years or more. That's actually a national disaster in some sense. All right, so let's summarize. So the inventory distribution by industry, right, is country dependent. Right, for the US, consumer durables and apparel has the most inventories or inventory problems, with a median of 23% of assets in inventory, which is 132 days. For China, right, the real estate has the most inventory or inventory problems, right, with a 35% of assets in inventory as a median and 1,200 days. Now, they also share some commonalities, right? That is, inventory is important to both of their food and stable retailing and the retailing industries. Now, we can also, so what we just saw is a snapshot in time, right? What about inventory changes over time? How does inventory changes over time? How is inventory affected by, let's say, extraordinary events like COVID and so on? Right. For the US, we can see that the healthcare sector constantly have the highest inventory days. Actually, it picked up recently during COVID, and which is followed by IT, information technology. It's very interesting, right? And consumer staples. All right, so this is the inventory days over time for US healthcare sector. And these are for IT and consumer staples. And in fact, energy has the lowest inventory days for the United States. Not sure if that's a good thing, because if we're running too low on fuel, it could be a problem. Now, for China, the picture is completely different, right? Real estate consistently have the highest inventory days, right? More than 1,000 days over all these years, right? Now, which is followed by healthcare. That is the pink, blue line here. And telecom, you can see very clearly because real estate is too high. But if you check carefully, you'll find out telecommunication has the lowest inventory days for China. Okay, now the next question I'm asking is, surely that inventory is not evenly distributed in your supply chain, right? From consumer-facing industries such as retailing, right, to distribution, manufacturing, suppliers, and raw materials. Right. The question is, which segment, right, of a supply chain may carry a large amount of inventory and less likely to have inventory problems? All right. Have you ever asked this question? Okay, let's see. The answer is clearly industry dependent. Right. For example, right, let's look at the world's food supply chain. The world's food supply chain year 2021. Right. We'll find out that retailers, food retailers, right, such as hypermarkets and supercenters, right, they have the largest amount of inventories in dollar value, and likely, right, inventory, the biggest inventory problems. And this is followed by brewers right here, right? If you look at the upper left corner, the brewers, which makes sense because, you know, the more valuable, the longer the whole inventory, the more valuable the inventory is. Right. Now, for technology supply chain, right, such as semiconductors, right, it's not the most downstream has the most inventories. Actually, it is somewhere in the upstream, that is the semiconductor equipment and materials, right, holds the highest inventory in dollar value, right, such as these companies, right, ASML, right, and Advanced Materials and NAND Research Corporations and so on. And they are followed by computer and electronics retail and automobile parts and equipments. Now, what I'm saying is it's just a snapshot, right, in time. It may change across, this is for the entire world. So we aggregate all the data from the world. If you look at individual countries, the picture might look slightly different. And if you go, you know, across different years, it could also change, right? So that's why it's important to know what's happening currently. Right. Okay, let's see how much time we have. Half an hour. Okay, now I will spend 10 more minutes and I will open up for questions. So we'll answer the first question, right? So in which industries or countries or segments of supply chain do we have the most inventory, or inventory is most relevant? Now let's try to answer the second question using data, right? How may inventory affect financial performance? Now, this is actually a very valid question because we spend so much time and efforts on managing inventories. What do we get? Right? What do we get? Right. So let's look at several perspectives. First, look at sales, general, and administrative cost, and also we look at gross margins and so on. Right. Okay. Let's first look at U.S. retailing industry. Right. Let's look at specifically S&P 500 companies. We find a consistent, strong negative correlation, right, between inventory turnover and sales, general, and administrative cost as a percentage of the total revenue, right, for retailing, right, which means right? If you increase inventory turnover or if you improve inventory efficiency, right, you might reduce the operating cost of running this shop or this retail chain. Right, if you look at this is a regression done for different years, right? And it look pretty much the same, right? The slope doesn't vary too much, right? And the slope looks the same. Now, we also find a strong negative correlation, right, between inventory turnover and the gross margin. Okay, actually, back in year 2005, right, Gore and Fisher and Raymond published an empirical paper to talk about this. Right, it's the same observation, but of course, what do we find is this observation is valid, right, for all these years. Right, the insights behind that is if you see here, gross margin, higher gross margin means more expensive products, right? Higher gross margin means more expensive products. So expensive items tends to move slower. We call them slow movers. And you also want to stock high because you don't want to lose sales. Thus, inventory turnover are likely to be smaller, right? On the other hand, right, lower gross margin items means cheaper products, usually fast movers, right? And we tend to have higher inventory turns, right? So this observation is quite time independent, right, for US retailing. Now, what's interesting is you will observe the same thing, same negative correlation for the other industries as well, right? Such as automobile manufacturers, such as household appliances, such as refrigerators and washing machines, right? And home furnishing industries, right? But with a different slope, right? Some are steeper, some are flatter, right? Some steeper, some are flatter. Right, but all very strong correlations, right? Now, I want to point out that for some industries, such as semiconductor and technology hardware, this correlation may not exist at all, which I'm not showing here. But if you look at data, right? If you're interested, I can send you that data, right? So for some industries, you may not observe such correlations. Okay. All right. So finally, let's answer the last question, right? Which is, how do I know if I have an inventory problem? The question is valid because one company may already be running its inventories at optimal or close to optimal, right? Thus, there's little room for improvements. However, another company may have a huge room for improvement, right? The question is, how do we know? Right? How do we know? How do we discover that we have an inventory problem? Right? Okay, now the answer actually is very simple, but you need a lot of data, right? The answer is benchmarking, right? And let me just give you a simple example, right? If my revenue, this is my real life example, right? If my revenue is half of yours, right? If my revenue is half of yours, but I hold the same amount of inventory, let's say in dollar value, as you do, then I must have an inventory problem. Assuming you and I were in the same industry, selling the same products, right? Or in the same segment of the supply chain. Okay, makes sense? Right, so two companies selling identical products in the same segment of the supply chain, but have very different inventory days or inventory turnover, right? That tells us something, right? So let me illustrate this by example, right? The example of Macy's versus Amazon. I know Amazon is online, Macy's was offline, but if you look at the products they're selling, if you look at the, where they stand in the supply chain, they're in the same place. They just use different technologies, right, to do the same thing. Okay, Macy's, right, is called America's department stores, which was founded, right, in 1858, right, about 160 years. Now Amazon was founded in 1994, right? It's the America's major online store. You probably heard Amazon was crazy hiring people in the pandemic, right? Which is true. Actually, they hire a bit too many people. So let's first look at a ranking of inventories, a ranking of US retailing companies, S&P 500 retailing companies, right, by inventory dates, right? I wouldn't find out which retailers may have inventory problem, which may not, right? If you look carefully, Amazon actually ranked #1, right, in terms of who has the shortest inventory dates, which is about maybe 30, 40 days. And Macy's should be ranked, right, around 12, right, with inventory days about 106 days. Now, it was not in this list. It was delisted from S&P 500 due to its stock market performance, I think in the year 2019. Okay, let's do a side-by-side comparison, right, between these two companies. We can see that, right, this is a enterprise comparison by size. That is their revenues, their margin, their profits, and so on. And on your right, you can see an enterprise comparison by efficiency. Right, that is the inventory dates, asset turnover, cash cycles, and so on. Right, the red lines shows Macy's. The blue one is Amazon. So we can see that Amazon is much bigger than Macy's in all dimensions in terms of size. Now, if you look at efficiency, right, Amazon also outperformed Macy's in many dimensions, right, such as inventory dates, cash, conversion cycle, right, and sales general and administrative costs over total revenue, right, than Macy's. And but Macy's also has a better performance in, let's say, in payable days versus receivable days. Right, actually, the receivable days over payable days for Macy's. Right, so I'm sorry, Macy's payable days is 25 times receivable days. You know what that means? His payable days is 25 times its receivable days. And Amazon is 5 times. So in some sense, Amazon is treating its suppliers better, right? Macy's is delaying its payment to the suppliers by a lot more than Amazon, 25 times its receivable days. Okay, so the suppliers of Macy's will suffer a very long time cycle to get paid. Okay, that's a snapshot in time, only for 2021, right? If you look at the trend over time, we'll see this observation is consistent over time, right? The blue line is now Macy's, and the red line is now Amazon. So we can see the consistent gap in inventory dates between these two companies, and also a consistent gap, right, between their cash conversion cycles. Now, I want to point out this, right, in terms of labor productivity, right, that is the total revenue of the company divided by how many employees they have, right? Amazon was much better than Macy's in year 2008, even in year 2019, but if you look into 2020 and 2021, Amazon's labor productivity dropped significantly and start to match, right, Macy's, right? So that could mean that Amazon's labor productivity, Amazon hired maybe too many people during the pandemic. Now, if you also look at the payable days versus receivable days, right, the trend of this ratio over time, you can see that Macy's actually increased its payable days significantly, right, during the pandemic or after pandemic. So it becomes a harder time for Macy's suppliers, right? While Amazon actually remains quite consistent. All right. Now, one last thing I want to say is, let's do a revenue breakdown, right, to understand the pricing of these two companies and also their cost structure, right? For US retailing, we can see that the average cost of goods sold is about 72% of the revenue. But Macy's is 59%, and Amazon is 85%. Do you know what that means? Okay, here's what that means. Right, let's say for an item that costs $100, right? If you go to Macy's, you buy this item, you're going to pay $169. If you go to Amazon, you pay $116. Right? That's what it means. So Macy's has a much higher pricing than Amazon. Right? But if you look at operating cost, sales general administrative cost, Macy's is like 31%. Right? The industry average is 17%, and Amazon is 8 or 9%. Macy's spend way too much on sales general administrative cost, which includes the inventory cost. Okay, finally, let's use the asset breakdown. Let's show where the problem lies. Right? Why do they spend so much on SGA cost? Right? And the US retailing average about 17%. In inventory, Macy's is about 25%, and Amazon is about 8%. Right? So Macy's clearly have an inventory problem. And Amazon, on the other hand, is performing quite well on inventory management. So let me recap. Okay, so Amazon, lower pricing versus Macy's higher pricing. Right? But even with the lower pricing, right, Amazon is making higher profit than Macy's. Right? Amazon was able to achieve that, right? Use many different things, including lower SGA cost. And Macy's has much higher SGA cost. And which one of the reasons, as we have shown the correlation before, right, is lower inventory and cash cycle for Amazon, and higher inventory and cash cycle for Macy's. So the conclusion is Macy's do need to improve inventories and reduce SG&A cost. All right, let me conclude the Webler with a jobs code. Again, if you divide the problem correctly, you almost have the solution. I hope you see the value of data-driven problem discovery in operations and supply chains, and a huge uncharted market for such skills. Right? Any questions?